Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to this event, which sounds extremely interesting for many of us, particularly journalists and other people. It will be Ambassador Roberto Balzaretti. He is the former Swiss mission ambassador to the European Union and is now responsible for the asset recovery dossier at the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, and he will explain to you what are the instruments his country is putting in place for to strengthen the fight against the proceeds of corruption. So we will listen to you, Mr. Balzaretti, with great interest, and there will be a question and answer session after the speech. Sure. Thank you very much. And on behalf of the Press Club, I give you a very warm welcome this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I think I will stand for this introductory remarks, and then I sit down to take your questions if you have some questions. Thank you to the Press Club for hosting this event. It's a pleasure to be back in Brussels, and I would like to greet among our audience this morning the actual head of the Swiss mission to the European Union, my colleague Bucher. Thank you for being here. Very nice of you. So, you said we have put in place, we are putting in place, actually we have put in place, we are still working on that. It's a work in progress that started actually in 1986. And I will tell you a short story. By the way, almost everything I'm telling you this morning is in the brochure you found while entering this room, of course in better words than mine this morning. The story starts in 1986 when the Swiss government took an unprecedented decision to freeze the assets of the President of the Philippines, Mr. Ferdinando Marcos, and his entourage. And actually it happened in a very singular way. The cabinet, the whole government, was at a state dinner for the Finnish president in Bern, when two state secretaries of two different ministries of the Swiss government received from two major Swiss banks, I will not mention, the information that they had assets of Ferdinando Marcos and of his family. So there were news coming in, of the destitution of President Marcos. The two banks called two different high officials with the Swiss administration, and they happened to be at that dinner with their bosses. And so the Swiss government could have that evening a cabinet meeting on the side of this formal dinner for the Finnish president, and take the decision to freeze the assets based on a constitutional provision we still have in our constitution, which allows the government to take decisions to preserve interest of in foreign matters, Swiss interest in foreign matters. So for the first time in Swiss history, assets were frozen preventively. So before there would be, and there was after that, a request for judicial assistance before a judge would order this freezing. And since then, so this was 1986, more than 30 years ago, since then we have continued developing, refining our practices in handling looted assets. Today we continue working to counter abuse of our financial system by corrupt leaders, in fighting precisely what we call money from stolen assets from PEPs. PEPs is an acronym which means politically exposed person, you know, of course, presidents, ministers, members of the government, but also senior politicians, judicial, military, political party officials, as well as senior executives of state-owned corporations of national importance, and of course their families and associates. So you see it's a very large program we have in front of us. And why do we do so? Well, we do so, I think, for two main reasons. The first, and apart from ethical or moral reasons, which are would be good enough to do so, but for two main reasons. The first is that we have no interest in allowing an abuse of our financial system. I know Switzerland is one of the world leading financial centers. We have no interest in allowing abuse of that financial center. Today, reputation and integrity are key factors in global competition. And the second major reason is our position as a donor state. We spend big amount of money in development cooperation abroad. We promote good governance, anti-corruption measures in our international cooperation programs. We engage in strengthening the rule of law and eradicating impunity, and so it would make no sense, you know, to spend that money on one hand and having this money stolen and hidden in our banks and on the other. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that corruption involves huge amount of money. Estimates of the World Bank, you know, of 20 to 40 billion dollars every year that are stolen in developing and emerging countries. And when you steal this money, you know, when someone enriches himself or herself in stealing this money, you actually, what you're doing, you are robbing people of development prospects with devastating consequences for a country, society, and economy. And there is a clear link that has been established between corruption and poverty. So you fight corruption, you alleviate poverty, you engage in development cooperation, you have to be against corruption. This is, if you like, you know, the background of our action in this regard. The action is mainly based on two pillars. The first one being prevention, and the second one being fight against and restitution of looted assets. So the first thing is that, of course, one should prevent the money from entering at all the country, the financial sector. Unfortunately, it happened in the past. We work so that it doesn't happen in the future, but it might well happen again. If this happens, then the other key element is to be able to identify, to freeze preventively, rapidly, and if the money is criminal in origin, to return that money, that stolen assets, to the country of origin. And this is what I will tell you in a while. But perhaps a couple of words on prevention. We have international standards. We have Swiss standards that set the rules on how financial intermediaries have to maintain relationship with specific clients, like PEPs. And there I have to say that it is not forbidden for a bank, you know, to have a business relation with a politically exposed person. Or, for instance, I would not be able to have a banking account if this were so. But what we require from banks, and when I say we in Switzerland, but these are international standards, by the way, is that such specific special clients are subject to enhanced due diligence requirements. So you have to be very cautious when you open a business relationship with those specific clients. And secondly, the first thing is to be cautious in abstract terms. The second point is to be cautious in very concrete terms on every transaction that is made on those bank accounts or business relationships that have been opened with these special clients. In Switzerland, we have legislation, I will come back on that, that obliges banks to report to the authorities any particular, any non-usual transaction on a given banking account. And not only asks the bank to do so, it also asks to preventively freeze the banking account until the authority has given green light to defreeze the amount without telling the client. So you do so, you are very cautious on with whom you deal with, and once you have a business relationship, you're very cautious on what's happening on a given banking account. And then, of course, if you have an international legal assistance process, which is a very specific way of cooperating between states, anytime suspicious assets can be frozen pending a judicial determination of the source of the fund. Now, back to restitution. There is no one-fits-all solution, actually. Every case is different. I will mention some cases in a couple of minutes. Every case is different, must be dealt very specifically. We need to be, at the same time, pragmatic, so find the right solution, and creative. And we need to establish a very close cooperation between requesting states and requested states. So the states requesting for possible stolen assets and the states where those assets might be. We have made a high priority at the same time to share expertise with other countries, to work very closely with experienced non-profit organizations. There are two I want to mention. The one is the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, STAR, of the World Bank and of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna. And the other one is the International Center for Asset Recovery, ICAR, at the Basel Institute for Governance. Both the cooperation among states and the cooperation and support given by non-profit organizations like the two I mentioned are very important. And by the way, ICAR and STAR, these two organizations, they play also a significant role in the continuing development of national and international standards. So not only they are useful in specific cases, but they are also very useful in the reflection we are conducting to make the legal framework more effective. As I told you, or I haven't, but I tell you now, since 1986, we have frozen quite an amount of money and returned that money, about 2 billion Swiss francs or US dollars, about the same these days, to the countries of origin of the assets. This is more than any other financial center in the world. And the list of cases found in the brochure is also quite impressive. Goes from countries like Peru to Angola, Nigeria, the Philippines, of course. Nigeria and the Philippines, very important cases. Philippines, almost 700 million, and Nigeria, the first Nigerian case, because there is a second one ongoing, 700 millions. There are cases still ongoing. One which is, if you look at the amounts, seems less important, but it is important, which is Haiti. The second Nigeria case, as I said, there still is a case with Peru. And then there are assets of politically exposed persons which are frozen on a slightly different ground for slightly different reasons. These are the assets in the framework of the spring revolutions in Northern Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, or in Ukraine. Perhaps a word on that. It was back some years. This money, which is frozen, still frozen today, in the framework of Egyptian, Tunisian, and Ukrainian so-called revolutions, they are still frozen. We have an ordinance of the government, maintaining the freeze. The idea is to give time for the criminal investigations underway and support judicial cooperation with the countries concerned. And so there we have to take into account, of course, the political changes taking place in the countries and the fact that it is not always easy for those countries, precisely in a time of big political change, to follow judicial assistance mechanisms which are very demanding and must be very, very precise. We will have a discussion at the end of this year, because the freezes will expire in 1 year, more or less in 1 year. You can continue them for a subsequent period of 1 year. And so at the beginning of 2018, the Swiss government will reevaluate the situation in each of the 3 countries concerned, Egypt, Tunisia, and Ukraine, and then decide whether to launch the freeze on the basis of the decisions taken more or less 6 months ago, some months ago, or change them, review list of persons, the amount, the assets of which, of whom were frozen. How do we restitute? Perhaps 2 examples so that you understand how complex, how complicated this is, but at the same time, how we can try and find some creative solution when it precisely because it is complicated. We have a Kazakh case. We had a Kazakh case. It's concluded now, where we decided to establish a trilateral monitoring system to restitute an amount of about 115 US dollars, million of US dollars. This money was returned by Switzerland and used for projects to benefit disadvantaged young people. And to do so, we established an independent foundation in Kazakhstan, in which the funds were transferred in installments under the monitoring of the World Bank. So what you have here is 150 million transferred to an independent foundation under supervision of an international organization. And so you make sure that the money goes back to the people of the country it was stolen from, but in a monitored way, so that you can be assured that it serves the purpose of the restitution. These funds, these 150 millions, were used to improve living condition of 200,000 Kazakhs, while enhancing local capacities and expertise. So it was kind of investment too in the future. Now, you also have setbacks when you do these things. It's not that everything goes well. The fact of having to establish such an independent foundation was very complex, very complicated, administratively cumbersome. And so the second case we have with Kazakhstan, where 48 millions originating from a criminal case were involved, they were not restituted through an independent foundation, but assigned to the World Bank for World Bank projects. So we went an easier way in the second case. Similarly with Angola, there we concluded bilateral agreements, so state-to-state, in 2005 and 2012, international agreements governing the return and the use of funds frozen in the canton of Geneva. The first case was 21 million that were used to strengthen agricultural, vocational education and training in Angola, and to fund mine clearance programs. because Angola is one of the most heavily mined countries in the world. And the second restitution, 43 million, will fund development projects. So with the supervision of our development cooperation. So it really depends pretty much on the situation. Sometimes you conclude a bilateral agreement, sometimes you establish an independent foundation, sometimes you conclude an agreement with intervention of a third party, like the World Bank, and so on. In Haiti, for instance, we are working on the restitution of the 7.3 million. We are looking for a project of the civil society in Haiti to fund with this money, but of course you need a bilateral agreement with the country, and you need to make sure that there is an independent supervision on the use of the money you restitute. Now, we can come back to that if you have questions, and by the way, again, you will find in the brochure you have found in this room detailed explanations on many of the cases we have to deal with. Perhaps some words about the legal framework we can use to do all that. The newest piece of legislation is the Foreign Illicit Assets Act, which is a law that was passed on the 18th of December 2015 by our Parliament and entered into force 1st of July 2016. It's a novum, actually. I think that we are, if not the only country, one of the fewest countries on the world having this kind of legislation. If I'm not mistaken, Canada has something similar. The idea is to address the situation where foreign leaders have, in all probability, this is already an important point, enriched themselves by misappropriating assets through corrupt practices or other felonies and by transferring them abroad. So you have a preventive freezing of assets that in a credible way you deem not to be legally deposited in Switzerland. You have the freezing, and then if there is a reason to do so, you have the confiscation of those assets and the restitution. Now, this law offers in particular a legal remedy, help, in cases where mutual legal assistance in criminal matters is not possible. I don't want to be too technical, but in the normal world, you have criminal proceedings in country A, which lead to the discovery of assets in country B. You have a request to country B to freeze the assets there and restitute them because they are produce of crime in country A. That's the ideal world. Sometimes it's very complicated in country A to prove that the money is of illicit origin. Sometimes, especially when you have big political changes, the judicial structures are not there to do this job. Sometimes you don't have a state anymore, but still the money is in country B. And so what we have with this law is that country B can freeze the money in a preventive way, pending either a request for judicial assistance and then restitute on this basis, or if there is no judicial assistance because it is not possible, or because the situation in country A is not the situation which is normally given, to address in the formal procedure, to restitute because, and this is the second very important element of this new piece of legislation, because the persons having that big amount of money in country B has to prove himself or herself that the money was earned legally. So there is a reverse of the burden of proof and the presumption that such assets are of illicit origin when certain conditions are fulfilled. By the way, the law also provides for measures to help origin countries in their efforts to recover assets, technical assistance, including, and this is perhaps the third important point, an unprompted transmission of information to the country of origin. So if we discover something which we deem to be suspicious, we can inform, without being asked, on a voluntary basis, the country of origin that there might be something wrong in that banking account. It deals with all that, and at the same time the law is of course a deterrent for future cases, because it should raise awareness, including for financial intermediaries, that there is no use in trying to hide things. Things will pop up, and once they pop up, we will be able to freeze assets and restitute them. It's also, and here I leave the Swiss ground to go international one, is a way of implementing, in a very significant way, by the way, the principles of the Convention Anti-Corruption of the UN. Now, this is not the only piece of legislation we have. This Foreign Illicit Assets Act complements the Swiss legal arsenal. We have, like in 1986, we still have the possibility of freezing ordinances issued by the government, which are of course of limited duration. We have a federal act on combating money laundering and the financing of terrorism in the financial sector. There you find important rules like the Know Your Customer rule, the fact that there cannot be in Switzerland anonymous bank accounts. You have of course the Swiss Criminal Code, where provisions allowing to lift banking secrecy in criminal proceedings. And then we have the Federal Act on International Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters, which allows, since 1981, to provide legal assistance to countries with which Switzerland has not entered a bilateral agreement. So either you have a bilateral agreement, which sets out the rules of cooperation in criminal matters, in criminal proceedings, or you don't, and then we have the law allowing under certain conditions to cooperate with a country with which we have no bilateral treaty. For instance, the law allows the sharing of evidence and the release of assets. So I would say that the arsenal is in place, all we need is there. And I would say that what we could achieve is quite impressive. But at the same time, we must acknowledge that there is still work to do, that setbacks are possible. For instance, in the big Abacha, the first Abacha case, Nigerian case, the World Bank complained of lack of transparency in budgeting and accounting. They had a very difficult time in supervising the use of the money. In one of the Angola cases I mentioned, NGO criticized some of the ways the funds were actually used. And we have to take this criticism into consideration. We have to try and make the system even better, precisely based on comments we get when we deal with that. One of the biggest challenges is the length of the restitution process, especially in very complex cases of state corruption, and even under the best conditions with a very close cooperation, the process often takes several years. And this is partly because even in the cases of dictators' funds, fundamental rights such as freedom of property cannot be restricted without observing minimum due process rules, and judicial remedies must be made available to the holder of the assets. Either we have a state where the rule of law prevails or not, and rule of law also prevails for criminals. But what we have tried and done, especially with this new Act on Foreign Illicit Assets, is at least to make it more difficult for anyone, to circumvent the law by, by outstretching precisely the rule of law. The reversal of the burden of proof in cases where it is very difficult to accept that a civil servant, even a well-paid civil servant, can make $100 million in a couple of years in office. This has proved to be very successful in many cases, especially in the first Abacha case. And We have to learn from that. We have to take into consideration these lessons learned when we structure new restitution processes. And as I said many times, this case is unique. Every case, is unique. We need the right mechanism to seek transparency and justice. And if you have this objective in mind, then you will find a solution for every case. We have given ourselves, Switzerland, the legal tools to play our role. We are ready to share our significant experience with other countries. We have had the last 15 years a group gathering together in Lausanne. These are the so-called Lausanne seminars, precisely to exchange experiences, to exchange views, to try and have a common set of principles we can use when dealing precisely in international cooperation and in preventing and freezing and confiscating assets. We have explained all that in the G20 framework. I think that we will continue reaching out. The idea is that, of course, the common strategy, continued efforts at international level need political support, mainly from G20 countries, but that they are also very necessary to achieve the goals we want to achieve. And the last word is partnership. We need effective and efficient mutual legal assistance procedures. We need to promote trustful partnership between requesting and requested countries, because that offers the best guarantees that the funds will be used to the benefit of people and not be misappropriated once again. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, okay, I just get the microphone.
May I just start by shouting? My name is Björn Huttin, I'm a public affairs consultant, and I believe that in Europe there's a huge list of people that are politically exposed, because even myself I'm on that. But I wonder, in the rest of the world, I would imagine that, especially when it comes to developing countries, that might not necessarily be the case. But the 2 billion that you're talking about sounds to me like a very small amount during 30 years. That's like about 70 million a year. So does that mean that most of these people realized that Switzerland was no longer a safe haven for them, so they put their money in other countries? Or does it mean that it is so difficult to discover that they get away with it?
Thank you very much. These are 2 very difficult questions. You can prove what you have. It's difficult to prove what you don't have. So I will try and speculate a little bit with you. Both elements you're mentioning might be true. The first is that perhaps for quite a long period of time, no one has really been interested in looking after these assets. The second, and is linked to that, is that we have today to deal with a very long past. We're talking about some of the persons I haven't mentioned, but you know whom we are talking about. They have been in office for decades, and so they were protected by this statute to some extent. All of a sudden, they're not protected anymore, so they become normal citizens again, and so you freeze the money, you do it preventively, so that because you know that you will be responsible if you don't do so. Some might have left Switzerland some years ago, because as I said, we started in 1986, freezing money. You put all that together, you might be right that the amounts you're restituting is the top of the iceberg. But that's what we could do. We could freeze, confiscate, and restitute this amount of money. In between, there have been many things. There is a new UN convention, new laws around the world. There are also laws which are not directly linked to the issue we are discussing here, more on the fiscal nature of things that will, ensure much more transparency around the world. Hopefully so. At least is what we have been trying to do in our country. So I know I'm not really answering your question. There might be much more money around, yes. Perhaps sometimes, there are too high expectations about the money around. You take the recent cases, the countries involved were talking about billions, stolen from their economies. And in Switzerland, you freeze, you have the global amounts in this brochure. You freeze 70, 80, 100 $1 million, which is not that much if you think that some of those persons have been in office for decades. But this is how it is. So we can only do what we can in our country. Hopefully others will follow. If you have a system, whereby it is very difficult to move money around from one place to the other, then perhaps we will have a kind of solution. What I've tried to describe to you is what we do once we freeze the money. The question you're asking is why haven't you frozen much more? Because we haven't found it. Okay, one of the other.
Thanks. From MLEX, John Riga. If you don't mind me to ask two, only because I have to give another briefing shortly, so I'm guessing these questions will come up anyway. One is specifically about the banking industry. Do you think that, okay, you said you have the arsenal in place, what you need, the tools that you have, but do you think on the enforcement side, if stricter action is required, or if it's maybe already adequate? And also, I should ask about the 1MDB case, if there's anything to say from the Swiss perspective. Thanks.
Well, on the second, the answer is easy. I'm not dealing with that, so I'm not able to give you any answer. On the first, if I understand you properly, the question is about sanctioning of banks themselves or of banking employees when these cases, happen to show that there was something wrong in the bank. We have what we need. Like all other countries around the world, we have criminal provisions, both for banks and for bank employees. You have administrative measures of the supervisory authority, the FINMA, also with quite expensive sanctions. The difficulty in the cases we are dealing with is that it is not that always that easy to prove that there was something wrongful at the beginning. It's not forbidden to open a banking account for a minister in office. And if you can prove that you went to the due diligence requirements you had to go through, well, and if 5 or 10 years later this person is in disgrace for the reason, then you might make the case that nothing wrongful was done, unless this person has been accumulating huge amount of money, during years which you cannot explain the origin. There, of course, there is something wrong. And there were in Switzerland some proceedings against banks, against bank employees in some of the cases I mentioned. So I think we have what we need there. Now I cannot discuss or judge on the sanctions that were taken, because this is something for the administrative or judicial authorities. Probably we are not that that hard as a European continental countries as other jurisdictions might be, but this is part of the legal culture of Europe. If you see what I mean. So.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Hello, Sarah Lewis, Money Laundering Bulletin. I'd just like to ask sort of two questions as well. First of all, how do you define corruption? Is it just hiding tax money? And politically exposed persons, there have been cases of French ministers who've hidden their money in Switzerland, and it wasn't Switzerland that sort of exposed them, and I don't think he restituted the assets. So where do you draw the line? You know, are corrupt people only from sort of developing countries, or is it only the big bang cases which we would expect you to act on? And the other question is, how do you think this fits in? How can you hold up your integrity on this when you have the Credit Suisse revelations from last week?
Okay, on corruption, there are definitions both in international conventions, UNCAC for instance, or in national legislations. You know what corruption is either the fact of actively getting something from an official you should not get without paying him money or her money on one side, or on the other side is that official asking you for money when you should do things you should not ask money for. That's a very simple definition. In fact, in all these international cases, the case for corruption should be made in the requesting state. You have a judicial decision that there was corruption and that the money which you might find in the other country is the revenue of that illegal activity, and so it must be seized, confiscated, and restituted. It applies to all cases. One could have a small one, a big one, doesn't matter. It's illegally to launder or try and launder money from a crime. The other question you're asking, first of all, my role is to explain to you what we do in Switzerland in order to have better laws and general better compliance of those laws. What you're mentioning has not much to do with what I told you this morning, or absolutely nothing, apart from the fact that what we want to achieve, and this is also true for Swiss banks, is that everyone complies with the law. Now, if other jurisdictions prove that this was not the case, either a Swiss entity or a foreign entity or whichever entity in that jurisdiction will be sanctioned, and this is how it should be.
Thank you for the person who have organized this conference. First of all, myself, I did up to now. I didn't send or doing transfer to Switzerland banks, but I have some question. I'm writing, among others, on international affairs. I'm doing expertise, lobbying, diplomatic lobbying, on better word. I have two questions. The first question concerns how do you know if the money comes from the family, or from the president family, the corrupt president, or from corruption, or from financial crimes? This is my first question. The second question, I don't know how they transfer this money. The question concerns exactly how they transfer this money, by diplomatic ways or by bank transfer. Thank you very much.
Well, the first question, in Switzerland, it was never, ever possible to open a banking account without telling the bank who you are. There was never such things as anonymous accounts, never. in spite of what you might think, what the James Bond movies might tell, it's just not possible. The bank knows whom you are. So if you go there and you are Mr. I don't know, President, whatever, well, if you go there and say, I'm Mr. Balzaretti, I want to put 10 millions, and in fact this money is the money of the President, the bank will look at me and say, okay, 10 millions, where do they come from? What have you done? Have you gained the lottery or what, 10 millions? You earn 100,000 per year and all of a sudden you come with 10 million. So the beneficial owner of the money must also be declared to the bank. Of course, you will tell me there are structures you can build and all kinds of things. But eventually this will pop up and eventually we will deal with the cases we have been dealing this morning. So this is the first point. The second is, how do you know that the money is criminal? That's the question. You don't always. You try and find out in asking the good questions when you start banking relations. Precisely, the know your customer rules. These are, by the way, international standards. You ask the question the first time you open a banking account, and I can tell you it's not pleasant these days to open a bank account in any European country, but in Switzerland it's not either. And then, once you have opened the banking account, every transaction on this account is monitored by the bank. So for instance, if I make 2,000 Swiss francs per year, you have 18,000 per month, my salary going on the banking account. If at the end of the next month there are 150,000 coming, the bank will ask me questions, or they will even freeze the banking account and inform the authority. There is a specific authority with the federal police that something strange is happening with my banking account. This is how you establish a pattern, and this is how you prevent criminal money from entering the system. It's the same everywhere in Europe, and you monitor what's happening to prevent it in the future. Some cases might be much more complicated because some of these assets were not per se illicit. If you are the son of a president and you got a concession to build a cell phone network and you got a commission of 10%, this is 200 millions, you have contracts, you can prove that this was totally legal. But at the same time, you got that concession because you were the son of, and probably, the amount of the contract was 10% higher because, the cell company is just not, giving money away like that. And so this is corruption. This is why these cases can be very, very complicated. But in fact, if you want to pursue that, and once you can pursue that, there are good chances that you establish the criminal origin of the money. Or you have in a country judicial proceedings establishing that. And then by way of requesting assistance to the other country, you can prove your case, and the other country cannot do anything else but freeze, confiscate, and restitute the money. How the transfers were made in many of these cases, I really don't know, but I can imagine that the deposit transfer from banks abroad and so on. Actually, the more documented the transfer is, the less suspicious it is. You see the paradox? If you have 10 millions coming in from a bank, wherever, to another bank, well, the second bank would be somehow, reassured that this is fine, because usually if you want to transfer criminal money, you don't go through the official system. But then then we are in the answer to your first question. Of course this was licit and legal, and it came in many cases probably from even the central bank of a given country, which makes for the bank receiving the money very difficult to say, well, sorry, this money is perhaps not licit. We are in very complex situations, and they are even more complicated because all of a sudden the political situation changes, and what was completely acceptable is not anymore. So I'm not defending our banks, the Swiss banking or European banking system. By the way, I'm talking about Switzerland because I'm Swiss, but you have the same issues in this country, in the UK, in Luxembourg, in Liechtenstein, and so on. It could continue forever. because they are doing what they have to do and they have some limits, or they decide not to have business at all with certain countries, with certain people. And this is a very difficult decision to take, you know, if you're in a competitive market.
There's a question here.
Yes. I come back, madam.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your presentation. I'm Kais Hashani from the Embassy of Tunisia in Brussels. My question is not about Tunisia. You raised the case of Kazakhstan. I would like to know what is the argument behind the decision that had been taken to establish a foundation. Was it a unilateral decision or a bilateral agreement with the Kazakh authorities to set up this kind of foundation?
Yes. Thank you very much. Actually, it was, I'm talking under the control of my colleagues, a trilateral arrangement, agreement between Swiss authorities, the Kazakh authorities, and the American authorities, because some of the money restituted to Kazakhstan was money seized by the American judicial system. So the idea was to make completely sure that this money is invested in people, and the way we found was that the establishment of this independent foundation was the best we could do. But this was, of course, based on an agreement, if this is your question, with the Kazakh authorities, so they agreed that we do so. We could otherwise not been, we would not have been able to establish, you know, a foundation of Kazakh law in Kazakhstan without them agreeing.
Oui, Odile Harvey pour le magazine .info et Radio Nord-Bretagne en France. I would like to know whether the Islamic banking can be a solution against corruption, because we notice that Islamic banking is progressing more and more in London, for instance, and in other countries as well. I don't know about your country, but this is, I'm just wondering what might have, you know, whether there might be a possibility against all this corruption.
I'm sorry, I have no idea. I'm not a specialist in banks anyway, so I don't know what Islamic banking really is. The point is, for me, another one. The only way of avoiding these things to happen in the future is to have legal provisions with teeth and authorities, judicial and administrative authorities with teeth. That's the only answer I have. Whether Islamic or not, I think it doesn't really matter, you know. But I don't know how Islamic banking could be less subject to corruption, not within the bank, but in the world, because that's the problem, you know. If an Islamic bank does not accept any money of any persons it doesn't know, well, perhaps, but is this the case? I don't know. We have to fight, in other words, we have to fight corruption first. That's the answer. If there is no corrupt money, then the banking, the way you bank will probably not matter that much.
There's a question here.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Katalin Harmai, Hungarian journalist. Do you see any need for your government, the Swiss government, and the European Union more closely cooperate on these issues? What I have in mind is that we know about many cases of corruption misusing EU funds, even official statistics. Some money generated this way might land in Swiss banks. So there is any scope for closely cooperate between the EU institutions and the Swiss government on this?
Well, with the European Union, I'm not that sure that the Union has the competencies we need when it comes to to seizing, blocking, and restituting, but of course we cooperate with European countries, and as we cooperate with any other country. First, second, there might be something when it comes to preventing corruption or preventing misuse of funds in countries where we act together. There are situations where Swiss cooperation and the European Union are side by side on certain projects, and then we should apply the same standards, monitor in the same way. It happens, by the way. The third is when we are active ourselves in some countries of the European Union. There we share, supervision and monitoring elements, so that we make sure that that we look at the same things, the European Union is looking at. Now, should any money be misused and come to Switzerland, which I do not hope at all, then, well, would apply what I've been describing before. It doesn't matter where the corrupt is at the beginning, if it's caught, the rules apply. And probably with member states of the European Union, cooperation would even be easier than it is with other countries around the world, because we have the same legal system.
Any questions?
Tarek Mahmoud, an journalist. You've talked about the cooperation with the G20, and I wonder how you think it will be effective, especially we have Russia with a problem, big problem of corruption. I don't know if the Russian banks are linked to the Swiss banks in a way. But anyway, the Russian banks are linked very well with the European banks. And you mentioned that you are expecting from, and you mentioned especially the three countries, Egypt, Tunisia, and Ukraine, if I remember well. That you are expecting that the judicial system will provide you with the with the documents to prove that there was cases of corruption, in spite of the fact that they are clear. And I doubt that in the three countries they will provide anything legal for the corruption. So, it's a cercle vicieux. So how will you manage next year? Thank you.
Well, the second question you're asking is a very important one, and it's something that gives us also an headache. Even though I will differentiate and come back in a while, the G20 issue, actually, we are not really cooperating with the G20. Switzerland is not a G20 country. What we are trying is to reach out to G20 member states so that they endorse, if possible, what we have been doing in this domain, or at least support, and this is important enough for them to acknowledge what we have been doing and support it. The second question, well, I'm not allowed to enter into cases too specifically, but the situation are really different in the three countries you have mentioned. Ukraine is a very young situation, so I think we should give Ukrainian authorities the chance to make their case. And this is why we have frozen the amount of money and precisely for them to have the time to make their case. Let's see. Egypt, the same, even though there we have the impression to some extent that kind of political arrangements could solve the situation. And by the way, these arrangements are okay if a person acknowledges that the money is stolen is 80% stolen and keeps 20% and gives back the rest. That's something that happens everywhere in the world, so it's okay. With Tunisia, the cooperation is working well. We have a small case of restitution, but it proves that the system works, and the judicial assistance is working well. So they are making their cases, and they're pretty confident that we will end with a success this story. So it's very different depending on where you are. But the good question actually you're asking, because a very good question is, how can you expect, in a period of big turmoil, that authorities function the same way they would in our country, where we have a stabilized situation, but after decades or hundreds of years of difficulties? It's a very good question. This is why we also have the other chapter of the law. Now, the two chapters do not mix. If you consider that a country is perfectly able to file a request for judicial assistance, then you cannot apply the law where it says that we confiscate and restitute in spite of lacking judicial assistance. Either you are able or you're not, but you cannot mix the two things. So you will have an explanation about the new legislation we passed. There is a chapter on preventive freezing, waiting for judicial assistance, which is the cases we are describing here. And there is another chapter on impossibility for the country to file judicial assistance, but highest credibility that the money was stolen. There you don't request a country to make the case, to say, well, the case is done, we do it for you. But you cannot mix the two things, and that's the difficulty. It's also difficult for a given country to accept, because it would have to accept that it's not working properly anymore. I say, sorry, we are not able to file for judicial assistance because, the situation is so bad in our country, nothing works. With some countries, this is, highly political. You would acknowledge this way that you are a kind of failed state, and it's not that easy. So let's do what we can. Let's help them help us. This is what we do. You can provide technical assistance. You can pay some lawyers. Let's not be too, how can I say, too difficult in the legal requirements which we have to comply with. And I think that in many of those cases we will find a good solution to restitute the money. And sometimes we will have to accept that we could not make the case. That's also how, the rule of law means that you cannot condemn someone while it is not guilty. That's how it works, Sometimes you also have to accept that you cannot have them all.
Okay, if there are no other questions, thank you very much, Ambassador.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.